JD Vance is not the actual vice presidential nominee. It's Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is a tech billionaire. He used to be JD Vance's boss. In 2022, he gave the most amount of money that any single person has ever given to a US Senate campaign to JD Vance. It was $15 million. Thiel has clout because he's one of the biggest venture capitalists in the United States. He founded PayPal. He was an angel investor early on with Facebook. He runs Palantir, which is one of the biggest defense contractors. Pundits have been saying stuff like JD Vance is a non-strategic pick because Ohio is a safe red state, because JD Vance doesn't, appeal to any existing demographic in the party. But they're not reading the room, because JD Vance is the tech crypto bro VC type candidate. And those are the people that the Republicans and Trump are trying to make overtures to. Trump just came out in favor of cryptocurrency. Elon Musk just endorsed him. That whole kind of like Web3 kind of cyber libertarian space is the world that they're trying to incorporate into the Republican fold, and Peter Thiel is the biggest figure in that world. So why is Trump trying to ally with these tech bro people? The first reason, of course, is money. They're very rich. You need donors to run campaigns, both for president and also down ballot. But the second reason, and this is pretty unverified, it might just be my paranoia, is that guys like Peter Thiel would know how to set up a surveillance state that could back up like the autocratic Christian nationalist thing that seems to be the Republican goal. And all you have to do is look at Peter Thiel's philosophy, which is legitimately scary. He has this essay called the Straussian moment. This essay is pretty bad. It's not really clear what Thiel is trying to say or to argue, and he's mostly marketed it in like the 20 years since he wrote it. It was written kind of in response to 9/11 as like the core of his intellectual agenda, but there's really no there. The three philosophers Peter Thiel is mostly in conversation with are objectively mid and discredited by most respectable people. There's Carl Schmitt, who was a legal scholar that helped set up the Third Reich and justify the seizure of authoritarian power. Then there's Rene Girard, who was like a Catholic reactionary literary scholar who used to be in France, but then got kicked out of the French academic system because he sucked and was stupid, and got sent to California, where he kind of made this little cult of personality, which included Thiel as well. And probably the best takedown of Girard is John Ganz's recent series on Unpopular Front. But like Rene Girard, if someone likes Rene Girard, red flag, they're stupid, they're probably bad politically. And then the third guy is Leo Strauss, who is one of the philosophical founders of modern American conservatism, really reactionary, and is impossible to read because he's incoherent, it's babble, it makes no sense. But the thread which ties these three guys and Thiel together is a rejection of modernity as an idea, of rationality as an approach to the world, and of the Enlightenment. So the notion that people have rights, that people are individuals, that nation states are the political unit of organization, that voting is something that maybe we should do, that we can trust people to govern themselves, all of this, even the foundational 1700s John Locke, Thomas Jefferson type part of it, Thiel is that was a world historical mistake. And the reason why the Enlightenment is wrong in Thiel's view is because it misunderstands human nature. It supposes that people care about things other than power. The Enlightenment says there's such a thing as truth, that love is a major motivator of human actions, that people want to get along with each other and collaborate. And Thiel says if you actually look at history, and if you look at September 11th and the War on Terror, which is what the Straussian moment is responding to, the fact that the liberal democracies pretend to believe in this stuff or actually do is what makes us weak. And so Thiel says we need a politics that just recognizes how raw power is the only force that matters in the world. And that means we need a dictator. We need someone who's just going to take control and seize the energies of state, and instead of putting them off into these sort of fake BS-y things like liberty, truth, human rights, just applying them as efficiently as possible in order to increase the progress of technology and in order to make the most profit for everybody. This is absolutely unhinged, and it is crazy that a guy who believes in all this stuff has accumulated this much power, essentially picked the vice presidential candidate and has his hands in all the pots, collecting data on people, owning all these tech companies. Now, there's been plenty of anti-democratic movements in the United States in the past, but I can't think of one that's been as explicitly against elections and human rights as this sort of Peter Thiel new right movement. Most of the time they pretend to care about this stuff. Even Trump, he's talking about freedom or whatever, but these guys know. These guys want us to be a dictatorship. Peter Thiel, the guy who introduced JD Vance to Donald Trump for the first time in 2021, who funded Vance's 2022 Senate campaign, who was an angel investor in Facebook early on, and the co-founder of Palantir, the autonomous fighting robot and defense analytics company that the Pentagon uses, he just did an interview on the Joe Rogan Experience. In this interview, which is over 3.5 hours long, Thiel and Rogan make a variety of interesting and false claims, but the most interesting thing that you can learn from it is that Thiel isn't very smart. Now, this goes against what I and a lot of people would like to believe about Thiel, and what I think the media narrative that he's cultivated has been, which is that he's this hyper-intelligent, hyper-evil, behind-the-scenes figure. I mean, he named his defense intelligence company after the Palantir Stone, which is a technology used by the villains in Lord of the Rings, so he's kind of been leaning into it all of these years. He is a bad guy, and he is powerful, but the problem is structural. A structural problem is harder to aim at because it's kind of baked into everything around you, and it's also more intimate. It's something that you see in yourself and in the people you love and care about. It's something you see in the systems you interact with every single day. It's something that all of us are probably a little bit complicit in. And that's a bit of a harder pill to swallow, but I think the problem being structural explains Thiel's personality and the personality of a lot of people like him. Because if the issue is structural, and these men did not get there by their own talent or effort, did not, conduct this evil master plot to take over the world and then diligently toil at it for decades. If what actually happened was they were able to sense a vulnerability within the system, were able to sense an inequity in the structure that they could take advantage of, then pretty much all they had to do was see that and then walk towards it. See that gap in the wall and walk through it. And I think what that takes isn't intelligence or hard work. It takes luck, which means it takes a high risk tolerance so that you're in the zone until you get lucky. And then it also takes a kind of amorality, a willingness to do whatever, or to, feel immune to any consequences that would come your way. So it takes just a certain kind of boldness, and I think a philosophy to back up that boldness, which is what we see Thiel explain to Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan and Thiel start talking about monkeys, which I think eventually happens at some point on every Joe Rogan Experience episode because Joe is obsessed with it. And Thiel, of course, is trying to turn this monkey pseudoscience conversation to his favorite brand of kind of like neo-reactionary mysticism, which is this French philosopher Rene Girard, who was Thiel's teacher at Stanford. Girard's thought is based on this idea of mimetic desire, that everything that people want is because they've seen someone else want it. That wanting is an imitative behavior. There's no such thing as like an individual desiring something. It's all socially constructed. If all desire is based off imitation, then that sets people up for conflict. If I only want something because I saw you wanting it, then we end up in a situation where we both want the same thing. And for Girard, that's like the essential engine of human civilization, going back to like Cain and Abel, Romulus and Remus. The way that essential violence gets channeled for a Girardian is through scapegoating. The community picks out somebody, one individual person that we can blame for all of our, frustrations and anger that comes out of wanting the same stuff. So like a Girard banger that he wrote was that the first pyramid was a pile of stones that got piled up from people stoning a victim. Peter Thiel quotes this pyramid line to Joe Rogan in a discussion of whether the pyramids at Giza were like an ancient power plant made by aliens or like a human civilization that we've since forgotten about. And Rogan's response is to say like, well, I watched a documentary about monkeys. And in the monkey documentary that Joe Rogan watched, contrary to what Peter Thiel says, the monkeys were not like competing over desires. It was not like there was one biggest monkey who was in charge and then all the other monkeys were like resentful of him. And then the monkeys like picked out a scapegoat and destroyed the scapegoat. No, Joe Rogan says, the most successful monkeys were the ones that could like form coalitions, the ones that were charming or nice or like made sure that, the food was distributed fairly. And Rogan goes on this whole spiel about like how monkeys have a strong ingrained sense of fairness. And in a way, that's like a more important factor in cohering them as like a pack or a pod or whatever than sort of envy or power rivalry. I did not watch the monkey documentary, but I think it is one of the best counter arguments you could have to Girardianism and people who believe in it, because Girard kind of proposes there's one cause behind all human behavior. It's this mimetic desire and then this cycle of scapegoating violence. And all of our ideas of like fairness or justice are just kind of facades that we put up in front of our violence. It's a very cynical view of human nature. I don't think it's totally inaccurate, but it misses out analytically on all the other evidence of the stuff that motivates people. In any human society, people do have a sense of some form of fairness, of love for one another. What makes Girardianism appealing to Thiel, I think Rene Girard himself is a little more complicated than this, but for Thiel, it's a way of like actually not having to deal with ethics at all. A Girardian can analyze any system and say it's not motivated by ideology. It's motivated by this ancient blood cycle of like, I only want it because you want it, and then we're going to be in conflict, and then we're going to scapegoat somebody. And you can apply that formula to everything that happens. And if everything that happens fits into that formula, then it's almost like there's no such thing as like individual responsibility or agency. If anything, a feeling of ideological conviction in Thiel's worldview would just be kind of like a way of covering up that violence. And I think honestly that's how he would interpret, like progressive movements. He'd say, they just want what the people in power have, and then they scapegoat the people in power, they scapegoat me, and I'm gonna let them scapegoat me by turning me into this like big, evil guy behind the scenes. Ultimately, this worldview has served Thiel well within the industries he's operated in. It's given him the amorality he needs to go out and get his bag. I think it's also given him the boldness he needs to see a weakness in the system and exploit it, because Girardianism sort of gives you this sense of like it's just the natural order. You're just enacting something that will inevitably happen in the cycle. But its ultimate weakness comes from the point Joe Rogan raises about the monkeys, that Girardianism misses out on like so much of what actually motivates people and the way they really behave. I think in the specific types of situations that Thiel was in, venture capital, the tech industry, defense contracting, you could say those are fields of the human experience that are motivated primarily by envy, scapegoating, and, a desire to commit violence. So the Joe Rogan interview gives me hope because it shows the weakness of this kind of guy. He's not very smart or sophisticated, actually, about the world. He just has a high risk tolerance, and he is kind of amoral. They don't actually know how to produce anything or build consensus. They just kind of know how to tear things down. And they also are not very broad-minded. They have this whole discussion about what cities to live in, and Thiel's like, oh, it would either be Miami or Nashville, but clearly he has no idea what any of the cities he's talking about are really like. And so I think ultimately the reason why these guys actually, might not succeed is because they don't have anything behind them other than this structural position that they've been able to take advantage of. And if you have a moment after watching this long video, check out the link in my bio. The first link on that link tree is going to be to a fundraiser for the Kadai family. They've already been displaced 3 times. They're trying to get to a safe place. And so if you can pitch in and help out, please do. Because it's hard out there, and mutual aid matters. I'm doing it through Operation Olive Branch. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and thanks. JD Vance is going to be vice president, and Peter Thiel and his boys are going to be closer to real power than they've ever been before. And so what happens when the dog finally catches the car? First thing to understand is in the short term, there's going to be a competition for power within the Republican coalition. And there's no cigar smoke-filled room where people are plotting this. It's just Trump eating a Big Mac, dictating his tweets to underlings. And so there's sort of the Peter Thiel type tech bro people. You could group Elon there as well, although I think there's a lot of differences within that group. There's in the transition sort of the Heritage Foundation Project 2025 people, and then the America First Priorities people, which is a whole other set. Then there's sort of the religious conservatives, and there's kind of the neocons, and all of these groups, you could say they are coordinating, but there are tensions and differences. And so Project 2025 does not equal Thiel, does not equal, Mike Johnson and kind of the radical Christian part of the coalition. We'll likely see a lot of jockeying for influence, a lot of peddling of influence, corruption, disorganization, chaos, just like in the first Trump term. And if I were to bet on it, I'd say that the post-liberal vision of J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel, it isn't going to necessarily be implemented by the Trump White House in the second term, in part because of these sort of issues with infighting in the coalition, but also because I think their vision ultimately isn't really about the state or the government. I'm borrowing this term post-liberal from philosopher Patrick Deneen and a few others that sort of run in the circles that Vance and Thiel run in, and as I understand it, liberal here does not mean like someone who's going to vote for the Democrats, someone who, has sort of liberal social positions in the way we use it in the 21st century. We're talking about sort of 19th century liberalism here, which to me is almost not an ideological position. It's a practical view of how things should be run. 19th century liberals would say things should be run by laws rather than by, a king or a queen. The mandate of authority for a 19th century liberal is a sense of like, here are the rules that have been written down. They might not necessarily be written down because people have voted on them and approved of them, but they're written down because through some kind of process, administrative, bureaucratic, discursive, it's been settled upon that this is how we're going to run society. And there's a sort of a secular aspect to it. It's not the divine right of kings. There's also kind of a business-friendly aspect to it, that it's usually premised on protecting property rights, maybe some other kinds of constitutional rights. And a great example of kind of a 19th century liberal state is like the United States in the 1800s, right? Like it's about white men of property, up until kind of the Jacksonian 1820s things where you start expanding the ballot to white men without property, and then, the post-Civil War Reconstruction Amendments extending it to black men, and then 1920 extending it to women. So a liberal state is more about this idea, not that you have a democratic sort of basis of government, but that you have a rules-based order that you're following. And this rules-based order is usually cohered around some kind of administrative, apparently logical structure and means of running the world. Technocracy, expertise, something like that. Law. So throughout the 1800s and 1900s, we saw the rise of this liberal model across the world. And like, if you asked yourself, what is the government? What is authority materially? You would say it's people working in offices, or, it's soldiers posted in military barracks as well, which are often just means there's offices at military barracks. It's paperwork. It's, forms of following the rules, writing the rules, interpreting the rules. So post-liberal to me means doing away with a setup that relies upon governments and laws and rules and sees these as kind of the field of politics. A post-liberal politics is kind of a post-nation state politics to me, and it focuses more upon kind of coalitions, identity groups, but then also upon, things like corporations, like Elon Musk's business empire. The goal of that is not to be a capitalist firm and make money. The goal of that is to colonize Mars and fulfill whatever ideological goals he has. I think you could say the same thing about sort of Thiel's projects at this point, about Facebook at this point, because if everyone spends all their time on this platform, everyone's getting surveilled via a platform, then the way you exercise authority isn't by forbidding certain things and allowing other things. It's by structuring the lives and choices of people in such a way that it will not occur to them to choose otherwise than what you want. It just wouldn't be possible kind of to, assemble a coalition that would go against what you want. It's like creating the labyrinth that people will live in, building the walls of it, building the turns and kind of the perambulations and the corkscrews into it in such a way that the labyrinth leads to the outcome you want. It will look like what TikTok looks like now, where it's mysterious, where authority comes from. If you break one of the rules, the algorithm can crack down on you, and, you don't really control what's on your For You page, right? It's matched to you. It corresponds to your interests, to your wishes, as expressed and interpreted by the machine, but it is not chosen by you. It is rather kind of extracted from you and then refined out of you. And so I see these sort of post-liberal structures of authority as being premised on that kind of operation. And ultimately, I think that's what Thiel, Vance, and Elon want to do to the United States. I can't say exactly what that would look like, but I think there's sort of three key features that we'd see. The first would be a disintegration of the boundary between the public and the private, between, what's kind of Elon's company or Trump's private company and what is, the public federal government. That line would be blurred. The second thing we'd see is a disintegration and decrease in sort of the authority given to Congress or the courts. We'd see, I think, government contractors taking on more power. We'd see, maybe like we do in China with WeChat, some kind of tech platform being braided into the sort of process of governance. And again, there'd be, a blurred line between public and private, so it would work. And the third thing is that materially, when you think of what authority looks like, it's not going to be people sitting in offices. It's either going to be some kind of AI algorithm, some sort of faceless system that is not human, or some, sort of specific named charismatic human. Likely one of the people, the cast of characters that we already know. Thinking through it all, this sounds very resistible to me, and I don't say that to like downplay or like try to end the video on a note of optimism. I say that because it sounds highly unstable, it sounds highly difficult to set this up. And if they're kind of moving through this sort of structural route, appointing their crazy judges, destroying the media, kind of selling off parts of the government, I think that means that the counter movement also has to go around the structure of elections, campaigns. All that stuff is a game that isn't really holding on anymore. And the field of politics is now structural, economic, cultural. It's about the platforms. It's about the places where we actually spend our lives and make our decisions. It's about kind of our intimate lives. It extends beyond just every 2 years you show up to vote and you go out and campaign and knock doors and make calls like I did this election for the Democrats. That's, I really believe in voting. I believe in elections still. But the field of politics has to move into this other realm of structures, of choices, and of, I think, ultimately the internet platforms, and trying to build a more democratic, more just internet, because that's how we build a more democratic and just society. So everyone's talking about this video of Peter Thiel, the billionaire patron of JD Vance and one of the richest and most powerful men in America, on Piers Morgan being asked about the UHC shooting and what his response was. Thiel looks really sweaty and he answers, and I quote, I don't know what to say. I still think you should try to make an argument, and I think this is you should, there may be things wrong with our healthcare system, but you have to make an argument, and you have to try to find a way to convince people and change it by that, and this is not going to work. Having thought a lot about Peter Thiel, more than I ever should have, what I'd guess is going on in his brain right now is he gets asked this question by Piers Morgan about the killing, and he's a big believer in this theory of Rene Girard, that is this French theorist that Peter took his class back in Stanford, who has this idea of mimetic desire, which says that people only want things because they've seen other people want those same things, which means that in any situation where you desire something, there's always three parties involved. Yourself, the desired thing, and then the person that you first saw want that desired thing. Naturally, this dynamic leads to envy between you and the person that you saw want the thing that you now want. And that envy leads you to scapegoat the person. And so a Girardian would read the UHC CEO situation and see it as a really clear illustration of that dynamic. The CEO is the scapegoat. And so I imagine Thiel is thinking this and wanting to explain it to the reporter, but it's kind of too intricate. It's not the right venue. It's not the 3-hour Joe Rogan podcast where he articulated it a few months ago. And so he doesn't. Instead, he sort of fumbles around his words. And what ends up coming out is sort of just the centrist boilerplate, but kind of delivered in the least compelling way. What people have picked up on in the exchange is a bit of fear on Thiel's part, and I think that's an accurate read. He doesn't want to be the next, like most CEOs in America. But you also get this sense of hypocrisy isn't quite the right word. Confusion isn't the right word either. But where he says that, there may be things wrong with our healthcare system, but you have to make an argument. Thiel's career has mostly been about changing the world, not through making arguments, but through exercising brute force, whether it's, economic force in terms of the amount of capital you can throw at a problem, invest in a startup, whether it's algorithmic force in terms of how you can disrupt the market or restructure it to serve you better, or, often violent force. He runs one of the biggest defense contractors in the United States. And Thiel's entire political philosophy exists to justify that use of force by saying that the people who you think are so ethical, who say, we live in a liberal democracy, we want to be deliberating, we want to be making arguments to change the world, he says those people are bogus and it's all fake and it's all covering up the actual violence of the system, which, that's arguably that's true. But then if you're going to make that point and use it then to justify your own sort of undemocratic, violent tactics, then as soon as you feel that violence coming back to you, if you flee to, hey, let's just make an argument about it, doesn't that kind of disprove the entire thing that you're doing? So the uncomfortable truth this reveals to Thiel and people like him who believe in this, pragmatist perspective, that you can take a few steps back and look down from 10,000 feet at all of human behavior and say, people are just motivated by envy and hatred and violence. And that's the way it was, is, and always will be. There's no change in that form of looking at human nature, and there's no ideas, there's no sense of what you would do if you did take power. It's just seeing it as that constant, in a way, stasis of just envy and this cycle repeats over and over again, then the only truth is that me and my people, however you define that, are in competition with everyone else, and you have to secure your own interests. And I think even for the people who do believe in that, like he does, there's this hollowness that happens where it's like, so what's the point then? If your interests are just, being in this game, like there's nothing higher. You're just always on this one lowest kind of common denominator of what people are or can be. And I think that's just an unsatisfying, incoherent place to be, because in our own lives, in our own experiences of reality, of meeting other people, of, consuming art, of participating in society, we do see that there's higher things at play, that there are better angels of the human, whatever. And not to get too sappy, but I think that's what any kind of durable and reasonable political project is based on, in whatever way they interpret that, trying to aim for the best of what people can do and can be. And so Thiel's entire thing is just sort of this fake, weird mirror of what was dominant and that what he thought he was disrupting. And now that we're in a different era of history where, sure, people who believe like him have the reins and are in control of a lot of systems, they actually aren't doing anything with that. Other than just sort of cementing their own simplistic interests and kind of trying to make the world more coherent and legible to them. And they're never going to be satisfied at all. That's kind of, I think, the weakness of that, is that you ask him, what do you think? And he actually thinks nothing. The most Skibidi-coded piece of media, other than Skibidi Toilet itself, is this 30-second Palantir ad called The Future of War that aired at the Army-Navy football game, which J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and Elon Musk attended. Palantir is one of the largest defense contractors in America, and it was founded by Peter Thiel, who also funded J.D. Vance's early political career, hired Vance at one point, helped start Facebook and PayPal, works together with Elon Musk and other conservative billionaires to kind of push policy to the right. And Palantir pretty much specializes in making anything digital or electronic that the US government needs. So that means drones, that means software solutions, that means data analytics for surveillance. You look at Palantir's website and it's actually kind of vague what they do, because they do a little bit of everything. And this ad is Palantir's pitch for flocks of drones to fly out of battleships, to be controlled by soldiers using touchpads, but then also little batons conducting these death drones like they're an orchestra, kind of melding, beauty and violence together in this weird, very it's giving kind of 1930s futurist vibes a little bit. And so if any company were going to be involved in a coming robot war, it would be Palantir. And that's exactly what Skibidi Toilet is about. It's about a robot war between cyborg beings that fight each other endlessly, ceaselessly. In Skibidi Toilet, you have these camera head soldiers that have a human body with usually a CCTV security surveillance camera for the head, and then they're fighting these Skibidi Toilets, which are human heads inside of a toilet body. And this is very serious, because I think the reason kids love Skibidi Toilet is it represents in part these themes that they're facing in their world of what does it mean to be watched, what does it mean when machines are fighting all around me, and what does it mean to sort of not be sure of your own agency. The entire Skibidi Toilet series is filmed from the perspective of one of these camera-headed cyborg soldiers, and so we are involved in the combat. It feels almost as if we're wearing a headset rather than watching a screen. And the Palantir ad is just like that, because there's shots from the perspective of these drones that are being piloted. In both Skibidi Toilet and the Palantir ad, there's also no spoken dialogue. It's just the steely silence of these machines doing as they're told to do and producing these explosions. You also see this treatment of violence as a kind of spectacle. Combat in Skibidi Toilet is precisely choreographed. It's a pyrotechnic ballet. The same thing with the Palantir ad. The drones are being conducted like an orchestra. It's giving artfulness. It's giving aesthetics. That's what it's all about. It's turning violence into something beautiful rather than what it really is, which is something ceaselessly ugly. What makes Skibidi Toilet more compelling and complicated than this defense contractor ad that aired during a football game is the fact that the gaze of a camera, the vision of the world through it, no longer amuses but accuses in Skibidi Toilet. We are the POV camera head, and the things that that character does are experienced visually as things that the audience itself does. Which means that when the camera head is flushing a Skibidi Toilet, when it's giving a thumbs up to one of the titans that's just, eliminated an entire squad of toilets, when it's sneaking into like a little toilet nursery where they're being raised and destroying them in the cradle, we are doing that, or we're unable to see it through any mode of perception other than that of the culprit. We're placed into those shoes right away. And so it's asking us to look at the image not as sort of an objective thing that's being done like the third-person camera of most movies, where it's not associated with any character or any particular perspective or position, fiction, but rather it's saying the way we see the world is implicated in that world. And I think that's something kids really vibe with when they watch Skibidi Toilet, because most of the visual media they're seeing taken on phones is taken by very personal, subjective cameras, rather than sort of objective, stepping back from the scene kinds of cameras. And this is where Skibidi diverges from Palantir in terms of aesthetics, because it's very much about the subjective from-the-ground view of these events. But the Palantir ad is promising a world of total top-down objective control. The tagline is, "Battles are won before they are fought." The idea is that you'll be able to plan it all out from the control room, every single detail, every single part of the operation, and there's nothing on the ground that matters. You're just sitting there tapping away on your smart devices, and war just happens. You know, the way a dishwasher washes dishes. There's no sort of nuance, there's no detail, there's no complication. Of course, in real war, it's full of complications and details. It's all about the infantrymen. It's not just about this top-down plan. But what Palantir is trying to sell isn't just, we're gonna beat your enemies. It's that we're gonna make the entire thing predictable. We're gonna make it all legible from the top-down angle. We're gonna make it all something that you can customize and do from kind of just the C-suite executive way of looking at the world. And that's ultimately the most valuable product under capitalism for a lot of these people. It's the promise that the world will make sense to you as a billionaire, as a master of war, as whatever you are. So what we're seeing in both cases isn't a war that's really being fought against the other side. In Skibidi Toilet, they destroy each other in exact proportion to how the other side destroys them. The robots are so good at fighting that they can never stop fighting. And it's the same thing in the Palantir ad. It's not really about beating the enemy. What it's really about is technology triumphing over human ambiguity, human confusion, and human relations. It's about making everything totally legible, totally readable, and what you're left with is the aesthetic of the Skibidi Toilet series or the Palantir ad. This vast, empty, silent landscape with no humans, just machines clashing and ever more, vivid explosions surrounding them. This is what Skibidi Toilet can teach us. Our era looks like robot war. These are the challenges we're up against, and the people who are gonna help fix it are you, the Zoomers, and all the Gen Alpha iPad babies. It's up to us. Peter Thiel, the tech billionaire and defense contractor you might know from his role grooming former employee J.D. Vance into a political career by giving more money to his Ohio Senate campaign than any other private citizen has ever given to a political campaign in the entirety of American history, he just dropped this crazy op-ed in the Financial Times. It's whack, it's wrong, but the worst part about it is that in some respects, you gotta hand it to him. Thiel's whole deal is that he isn't just rich or powerful or highly influential, he is a thought leader and an intellectual and a philosopher. Listen to this sentence. Trump's return to the White House augurs the apokalypsis of the Ancien Regime's secrets. What does that even mean? Can't you just try to be normal? Do you have to use untranslated Greek and French terms in the same sentence and then right after kind of vaguely threaten violence against people who were in power before you, but then kind of cryptically say, but for reconciliation to take place, there must first be truth? Like, who does he think he is? He thinks he's some bard on a mountaintop? Like, bro, you sell software as a service. Your hands are soft. You look at spreadsheets all day. You invest in companies that suck up the minutes of our lives and spit them back out as dollars. In the next paragraph, Thiel talks about my friend and colleague Eric Weinstein. And if you Google this guy, you'll find out two things about him. First, he proposed a theory of everything to solve all of modern physics called geometric unity. And it turned out that every other physicist pretty much rejected this, saw that it had no math equations at all involved in it, but he managed to kind of fool some reporters into thinking it was like a real innovation. And eventually he went on the Joe Rogan show, which is where every credible scientist goes to present their research. The second thing about Weinstein, and probably the more relevant one to Thiel, is he's the coiner of the term intellectual dark web, which he used to describe himself and a bunch of other, unorthodox thinkers who really were just right-wing grifters and were able to present themselves as intellectuals to people who, just kind of wanted to feel smart for believing in the prejudices they already had. Like, imagine saying that the people you hang out with are an intellectual dark web. Like, you might name your group chat something, but you wouldn't bring it out in the public. So yeah, the whole thing kind of reads like that, and that's why it's really annoying. But the basic core thesis of it is, in the past, the government and the media and, institutions, whatever that means, collaborated together to present a narrative of the world and of public life that was false. They covered up certain things. Thiel cites like the Kennedy assassination, COVID, Jeffrey Epstein, like whether these things actually were covered up and to what extent and to what way, he doesn't get into. He just kind of assumes that, the government lied about all this stuff, which, hey, maybe it did, but whatever. He goes on and he says, now that Trump has been reelected, all of this stuff is going to be revealed over the past few decades of what the government was doing, of what, big companies were doing. And the antidote for all this is just like the internet has revealed it. That's what's happened. And the reason why you gotta hand it to him is that in many ways that resembles the view that I have of the world, and maybe you have of it too. And I think the reason it resembles it is that that's a fairly obvious thing to conclude off of observing what's just happening in current events right now. Of course, there was a mainstream narrative that was lying to people. And of course, their grip is loosening, they're losing control. And it's clear that, the contributing factors to this loss of control are, as Thiel says, technology, and maybe right-wing populism. Because the diagnosis is correct, because he is saying something that is true about the world. The mainstream institutions have failed you. They've been lying to you. The enemy of your enemy is not always your friend. Just because Peter Thiel hates liberal institutions and you do too does not mean that Peter Thiel is your boy. And the same thing holds true for Zhao Hongshu. They could not care less about people who are in pain, about other people who might stand between them and a dollar. And that's the issue with Thiel. That's the issue, I think, with, the leadership of many of these autocratic countries. And our issue right now is that in this moment of decay, as the old thing, which, was not good, is falling apart, the only futures that seem really poised and prepared to step into that place are these autocratic, oligarchical ones. And I guess the one thought I keep having from like a historical perspective is the world won't be saved. It never has been, not once in human history. Worlds have always ended. Horrible things have happened so many times. But what can be done is the world can be loved. It can be carefully observed. It can be diligently improved. And that's what folks need to be out there doing, each in their own way, whether it's local, whether it's larger than that, whether it, takes a route that you can't anticipate right now. If that means getting an account on Zhao Hongshu, that's what I'll do, I guess. The point of it is to, I think, appreciate common sense and like decency and just like basic values and, the present moment and yourself or whatever it is, because that's something you really don't see with Thiel, right? Like, in a way, it reminds me of Elon. You have this guy who has everything, all the money, all the power, all the influence, but he just wants people to think he's smart in the same way Elon wants people to think he's funny. And so Thiel, posts these crazy essays in the same way that Elon posts his cringe memes, and it's never enough for either of them. And so maybe I think one of the most important things that anyone can do right now is, let it be enough, what you have, who you are, and act from there, and do what you can, do the best you can.